Hi guys, welcome to my Oni Assassin deck profile, and it'll probably be the last Oni Assassin deck profile on the channel. So let's get to it. Before I begin, I do want to preface that there is, I guess I'd like a little bit of feedback from the community if you guys have it. There's something, the main cycle of the deck, and we'll get to it, but the main cycle of the deck I want to kind of happen more often, but I'm struggling to try to find ways to make it happen more often. So I'll kind of bring it up when I get there. But starting off, obviously the Katana World Flag, and then the buddy is Fiend of Gaze Io. I mainly, really, a lot of Oni Assassin cards are viable as buddy. I just run Io because he's free, and you almost always want to play him regardless. So just there's no reason to not just have him as buddy and gain a free life. So starting with the size zeros is 4 copies of Oni Horde Underworld Legion. My deck runs off of being a closed center Oni Assassin deck, which I believe basically anybody at the end of the game will run it this way. But anyways, his call cost is you can put up to 1 card from your hand face down into a soul, so you can even play him for free if you want. And when an Oni Assassin monster enters the field by ambush, you burn your opponent for 1, and it only activates once per turn. Keep in mind this activates on each person's turn, so you can kind of go back and forth and keep burning and bouncing, or not bouncing, but burning and calling. So yeah, he's kind of the main one. The only issue I have with him is there is no tutor or anything for him, so you kind of have to just kind of draw into him, and if not, you are going to be kind of floundering on other. I say floundering, not in a terrible way, but in a less optimal way, because all the other Oni Assassins in the deck don't have Soul Guard. So, but yeah, he's kind of like the main zero you want on the field. Next up is the size 1s. And we're starting off with Lady Oni Uji Bridge Princess. She's also a good buddy. If you want to play her as buddy, you'll play her a lot. You can put up to 1 card from your hand face down into her soul. When she enters the field, you gain a gauge, and if she entered by ambush, you gain another gauge. So she's mainly the gain gauge ramp. But if you do need to get a card from your hand face down onto the field, you can do it. I do it sometimes. I try not to if I don't have to, but if push comes to shove and you want to get a card from your hand face down onto the field, she's a perfectly viable option. Next up is the buddy, Io. If I can get him onto the camera screen, there we go. 4 copies of Fiend of Gaze Io. He's free to call, very weak at 1/1, but his ability is what's important. And when he enters the field, you choose an Oni Assassin on your field, look at 3 cards from the top of your deck, and put up to 1 of the cards from the top of your deck face down into the card's soul, and then put the rest in the bottom in any order. And he just has innate ambush, so he's going to be very commonly called from Oni Horde Soul Call. Choose Oni Horde, put another card back into Oni Horde. So he helps just kind of get through the deck and between filter and just get the ambush cards you need out of the deck. He's just a really good card. Next up is 3 copies of Fiend of Ailments Affliction Oni. 3/1/1, pretty weak. Pay a gauge for him. He's the tutor for the item, which you definitely need with this deck. If you don't, you're probably going to kind of start to run out of gauge. But we'll get to the item soon enough. But when he enters the field, you can grab an Oni Assassin item from your deck and add it to hand and shuffle it. Then if you enter by ambush, you can equip it immediately by paying its equip cost. That's usually more either during your battle phase, or if you want to just get the item on the field during your opponent's turn. So future summons are cheaper with the item, but we'll get to the item. So yeah, he's just mainly the tutor of the deck. And I run him at 3 because you kind of really need to get the item, or like I said, you kind of start to be a little too gauge hungry for the deck, but we'll get there in a bit. But next up is Red Lady Oni Kureha. She costs 1 gauge, and when she enters the field, you can put a card with ambush other than herself from the drop zone to your hand. Then if she entered by ambush, you put a card from your hand face down into the soul of an Oni Assassin, and it does not have to be the card you grabbed. I've done it multiple times where you can grab a card from drop, shuffle your hand so your opponent doesn't know if it's the same card or not, and then just put a different card, or it could be the same card, and just mess with your opponent. And put it face down into the soul of an Oni Assassin on the field. So and she has ambush and move, so she's kind of meant to a lot of times grab the main size 3 of the deck, but you can even grab like Io or anything else. Also, during the first turn, let's say, You could always charge a monster with ambush, pay the gauge for Kureha, the card, pay the card that you charged, and then just grab the card with the ambush back. So her cost is minimally, pretty minimal, if you just know to charge and draw a ambush monster. So other than herself, just don't charge herself, pay the gauge and call herself, and because then you can't grab her own copy. So but that's a pretty easy, obvious thing you can just avoid. Moving on to the main size 3 of the deck is Mountain Deity Oni Blade Kitabuki. He's pretty expensive at 2 gauge and 1 life to call. When he enters the field, you choose an Oni Assassin on your field. Look at the top 5 cards of your deck. Put up to 2 of them face down to the chosen card's soul, and put the rest in the bottom in any order. So if you have Oni Horde on the field, you'll probably just choose to put the cards back underneath the Oni Horde. Then if you enter by ambush, your opponent has to choose and discard a card. And he has ambush and triple attack. Triple attack's nice, but surprisingly still doesn't seem like it's enough offensive push. But this is kind of the point of the deck, is to try to make your opponent discard themselves. And that's honestly kind of where I struggle to try to make this kind of proc more often. Right now it feels like maybe I can proc it twice on a good day, but I'd like to kind of more consistently get to maybe proc 3+ times. Usually on average I can at least have it proc once. But that's kind of an annoyance. But if you can get to 2 or more consistently, it's pretty strong. So if anyone has any more suggestions once I obviously show the rest of the deck, by all means, I'm kind of all ears. But yeah, kind of that's the main point, is to try to cycle Mountain Deity Kitabuki's discard ability. The other size 3 I run, and it's more for defensive purposes, is Shuten Demonic Deity Kitabuki. He costs 2 gauge. He's pretty beefy at 10-3-5. His first ability, which is not that great, but at the beginning of your turn, you can destroy all monsters in your opponent's field and deal damage to your opponent equal to the number of cards destroyed. There's a lot of anti-destruction, so this more than likely will not go off anyways. But his overkill is kind of the main purpose, where you can pay 1 gauge when a monster on your field would be destroyed, and you can choose a monster. It does not have to be the same monster that's being attacked, but you choose a monster on your field, and for the turn, that card can't be destroyed, period, for the turn. They could be attacked a million times, doesn't matter, it won't die. And he has ambush and move. So this is kind of more of a, if you're kind of expecting your opponent to kind of have a big walloping turn of multiple swings that like you just do not have the defensive spells to handle, you can call this Kitabuki off to the side. Usually you could probably choose Oni Horde, Underworld Legion, and he just won't be destroyed for the turn. And you still have all the souls in them safe. And it's almost kind of like a free turn, like just a free extra turn for yourself. So this is probably a pretty viable card that can be swapped out for other size 3s that you want, or really any other card. But this is just kind of like an extra size 3 of like, you need like that pause oh crap button. So like you could run Autobone if you want to try to nullify and destroy a card on your opponent's field. I'm not a huge fan of Autobone anymore, but it's an option. Next up is the item, and that's the only item in the deck. Dark Arms, Fiery Bloom, Violet Blades. Costs a gauge and a life, and it can attack through the center. So even if you have Oni Horde in the center, it can still attack through the center. This card can't be bounced or returned to the hand, so it's pretty safe on the field. And if you would call an Oni Assassin monster, the gauge cost written on it is reduced by 1, and that is the main point of this card, is you need that gauge reduction between Kitabuki's and Kurehas. The deck just can get overwhelming with gauge costs sometimes, and that's why I don't run, you'll see, but I don't run Under the Table, because if you can run Violet Blades and reduce the amount of cards you need to put into your gauge, so therefore you have more cards in your deck, therefore you can survive longer. That's kind of the point of this card. So, things like the Fume Cube was nice, but, I'd rather mitigate how much gauge I even need to pay than I have to pay the gauge and then gain the gauge back. So, I think it's pretty much kind of the most common weapon that anyone will use at the end of the game. Next up is 3 copies of Banquet for the Unrighteous. Between the consistency of checking the top 3 cards of your deck and putting a monster from them to your hand, or more commonly later in the game, you can put a card from the drop face down to the soul of a monster. Normally, I'd try to have it be Kitabuki, or if not, maybe another card that can get me to Kitabuki. But yeah, it's just a way to get cards from the drop back into the souls of like Oni Horde. Next up is a good draw spell. There's actually a few good draw spells in this deck, but the first one is Ibuki's Encouragement. At counter speed, you can put a soul from a card on your field into the drop, and if you do, you draw a card. So this is more, I suppose, if you want to be more aggressive. The deck doesn't really tend to want to be that aggressive. And then the second effect is when this face down card is put from the soul of an Oni assassin to the drop, you gain a gauge and draw. So I've even had it times where is Uji Bridge Princess, where it's like I'll play Uji Bridge Princess, put a copy underneath when I call her, obviously gain the gauge, or 2 if she entered by ambush, and then I'll just play another copy of Ibuki's Encouragement to take the other copy out to gauge and draw 2. Essentially, but you would draw, charge, and draw based on the order. Because you draw first for playing the card from hand, and then the copy that was face down out, you charge and draw. So, yeah. So there's some good just counterplay of just cycling your hand just to get more cards and a little more resources with itself. Next up is House of Assassins Oni Convoy. It's a set spell. You can put a card from your hand face down into the soul of an Oni assassin on the field, and if you do, you draw a card, and you can only set one of this once per set this one copy of this on the field, and you can only activate its ability once per turn. This really just helps kind of cycle out ambush monsters in your hand to get other potentially more useful cards from your deck. So pretty good staple card in my opinion. Give your hand some consistency. Next up is 4 copies of Midnight Bodyguard. It's the attack null for the deck. You can only cast it if you have an Oni assassin on the field, nullify the attack, and then you may put a soul from a card on the field into the drop, and if you do, you gain a gauge and a life. So a little bit of gauge gain, and between the 1 gauge here and then the 1 gauge reduction of the item, you could even, heck, just call Kitabuki from just this if you have literally 0 gauge after that. So, kind of helps with that. Another purpose of this card is because you are a close center deck, you are very prone to penetrate. So, this will at least help stop with penetrate. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty straightforward attack null, all things considered. A little weak in the grand scheme of things at the end of the game, but hey, it works with the deck and it's better than nothing. So, next up is the next draw spell, Underhanded Means Shedding Cycle. You drop a face down soul from an Oni assassin on the field, and you gain 2 life and draw 2. And it's at counter speed at literally any time, so you can play this on your turn and then another copy on your opponent's turn, just to draw a lot of cards. And the 2 life will really help with the life cost of the Mountain Deity Kitabuki, where he costs 2 gauge and a life. So I just run 4 copies because, oh no, you get extra copies, just play it on your opponent's turn. Like, it really doesn't clog up the hand because it's just free counter speed casting. Next up is the last draw spell of the deck, Hiding Oni. Put a soul from a card on your field to the drop. You gauge and draw 2. This is the original draw spell. I run it at 3 only because it is not counter speed like Underhanded Means Shedding Cycle, so I don't want to play it and then get a ton of copies back in my hand because then they're just dead for the turn until it cycles back around to my turn. So yeah, just another draw spell to gain some gauge. And like I mentioned before with the Midnight Bodyguard, if you have the item on the field and you play this, you gain the gauge, and you got the 1 gauge to play, Mountain Deity Kitabuki. So, the gauge cost, once you have the item, is pretty minimal for the deck. And then lastly, from the main deck is good old Demon Way Sakura Fubuki. Pay 2 life to nullify spell. This is just a nice one-of, and rules-wise, it is limited to 1, but it's a nice one-of just to kind of mess with your opponent and make them question, do I have the spell null? Do I not? Am I going to play it correctly? Am I going to not? So yeah, it's just a good card in general. Moving on to the sideboard, I do run 4 copies of Chest Break, primarily for the first effect of putting 2 spells from the opponent's field to the bottom of the deck in any order. This is not meant to be used for just any spells usually, but this is meant for either Cherry Blossom Dance or Invitation to Deathgrounds, where the set spells themselves exclusively say you cannot call cards from the drop, because if you can't call cards from the drop, you can't ambush, because that's calling from the drop. So As soon as they play one of those two set spells, you might as well just scoop. So at least with Chest Break, even I know Invitation Death Grounds with like Black Dragons, they can be potentially not destroyed by card effects. But as far as I know, I don't believe it has a can't be returned to deck by card effects. It might even have an anti bounce, but this is returns from the card from the field to the deck. So this is still different enough that it's still probably a viable sideboard. So that is the first kind of crucial card I would say that's important for the deck in the sideboard. Second off is Promise of Rainbow. Really, both of its effects are good for their own purposes, but the main purpose I had for Promise of Rainbow was the second of if you cast this for the turn, cards from your deck can't be dropped by opponent's card effects. So if you're playing against like an Abigail Mill card, then this will just stop. Keep in mind the first effect, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but when it's put from the drop from your deck by opponent's card effects, you can just grab this from the drop and add it to your hand. So if you kind of are starting to be affected by the milling, you can at least grab this from the first effect. And then if your opponent starts to try to mill you again, you can just be like, counter, no, I don't have to mill anymore, go away. And then worst case, if that doesn't happen, or maybe you're playing against a really aggressive, let's say, monster deck, you can just use the Snake Gaze effect of that counter speed, just rest a monster on your opponent's field. So this could just be a defensive spell, worst case. So couple useful niche situations that could help. And then last, and this is just really an alternative option for the Shuten Demonic Deity Kitabuki, the 2 copies of that, is Rampaging Evil Demon Akuro-O. He costs 2 gauge. When he enters the field, you can destroy a card on your opponent's field. If he entered by ambush, you can destroy another card on your opponent's field and deal 2 damage. The deal 2 damage is not dependent upon you destroying cards. So worst case, if there's nothing you can destroy, you can just burn your opponent for 2. I run this if you, let's say your opponent's down to like 4 or 6 life, and it's like it is just a slog to try to get around their field to actually hit them in person. You could try to play a few copies of Kuro just to burn them to death. If your opponent plays a deck that does not have a lot of anti-destruction, you can play him as well. That's kind of the secondary purpose of him. It's more just the burn. Like I said, there's at least a handful of size 3 alternative options. There's Ghetto Maru as well. There's Dark Arms Ibuki, the promo. So it's really kind of whatever you prefer. I've always kind of had a soft spot for a Kuro myself, so that's just kind of my preference. But whew, gonna hair my mouth. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's the deck. If you have any questions or anything, please let me know. If you have any opinions on how I can make the deck run better, let me know in the comments. I'll certainly consider it. If it's a big enough shift, I might even make another deck profile of it, just saying, it's working way better than the previous one. So this one is actually probably the most interactive of a request I will have for the deck profile. So, yeah, let me know. Thanks. Bye.